Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll go ahead and get started in just a few short minutes here. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Meta Polywall with the Orange County Water District. And on behalf of everyone here at OCWD, I'm excited to welcome you to our April webinar, A Tale of Two Basins, Managing Groundwater in Orange and Los Angeles counties. So yes, today's presentation will be all about managing groundwater in the two counties, and particularly the different approaches both OCWD and WRD take to manage their groundwater basins reliably and effectively. So before we begin, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. As a webinar attendee, you are muted. This is to reduce some background noise. However, should you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to type in your question into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Next slide. And to keep the webinar moving along, speakers will wait until the end of the presentation to answer questions, but feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box as you think of them, and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end. And in the event that we run out of time or do not get to your question, you can always email us at info@ocwd.com. And one last item, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel at OCWD Water News. You will also receive a link to the recording via email with the email address that you signed up with today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Next slide. Brian Partington. Brian manages the Hydrogeology department at the Water Replenishment District. He is responsible for providing technical analysis, review, and oversight for various projects related to artificial recharge, seawater intrusion, groundwater quality, conjunctive use, computer modeling, recycled water, and groundwater production in one of the most heavily utilized groundwater basins in California. He has over 20 years of experience in groundwater management and received a Bachelor of Science degree in geology from California State University, Fullerton. He is also a California professional geologist and certified hydrogeologist. And next is John Kennedy. John is the Executive Director of Engineering and Water Resources, where he is responsible for engineering, local resources, and administrative functions at the Orange County Water District. John's duties include preparing long-term financial projections and capital improvement programs, acting as liaison with 19 local cities and retail water districts served by OCWD, developing and administrating groundwater basin management programs, developing and implementing capital projects, establishing district water rates for groundwater pumping and annual pumping amounts, and purchasing imported water to recharge the groundwater basin. John has more than 35 years of experience in the water and civil engineering industry and has worked for OCWD since 1995. He holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Science degrees in both civil engineering from the University of Pittsburgh and a Master of Business Administration from Pepperdine University. John is a registered professional civil engineer in the state of California. So with that, let's get started. We'll kick it off with Brian.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and get started here. So why don't we go to the next slide? All right, so just a very brief background. I'm going to talk a little bit about Water Replenishment District, who we are, what our role is in managing groundwater, and then also really dive into our replenishment, really into the spreading grounds as well as the injection barriers. And then I'll talk a little bit about the water supply projects that we have coming up in the future. Next slide. So the Water Replenishment District, we were formed by the vote of the people in 1959, and this was pursuant to the Water Replenishment District Act of 1955. It's part of the California Water Code under Section 60,000. And basically, we're responsible for managing groundwater for 2 adjudicated basins located here in southern Los Angeles County. The basins are shown in the figure to the right, and they're separated by the Newport Inglewood fault zone. So on the left-hand side is the West Coast Basin, and that basin was adjudicated in 1961. And then on the right-hand side, that's the Central Basin, and that was adjudicated in 1965. Now, both of these judgments have been amended a couple times, most recently to better utilize the available storage space in the aquifers, which is the real big focus for us moving forward as we have a few big projects in our region to be considered for both the Central and the West Coast basins. Next slide. So we represent 43 cities. We have a service area of about 420 square miles, and we service over 4 million residents. So it's about 10% of the state's population. And so as you can imagine, we use quite a bit of water. It's roughly 550,000 acre feet per year. And we're fortunate that we have some very productive aquifers within both of these basins. We can obtain a majority of our water supply here locally, and then we also have plans to increase that groundwater use in the future. One of our key responsibilities, obviously, is to replenish the basin, but we also do quite a bit of monitoring so that we understand the water quality within both of the basins. Next slide. So the Water Replenishment District Act, it provides direction to our organization on how we're formed, how we're organized, the different powers that we have. It goes into the finances, how we develop a water replenishment assessment to fund our operations, any changes in our organization, and then also, obviously, as a government agency, the competitive bidding process. But really at its core, it allows us to manage and protect groundwater in both of these basins, the Central and West Coast Basin. And that one of the documents that we generate as part of the Water Code is the annual engineering survey and report. And really what that looks at is a 3-year period. It looks at documenting the previous water year conditions, and then it makes an estimate for the current water year, and then we make projections for the ensuing water year. And so we look at things like the total groundwater production, we calculate annual overdrafts, and we watch our accumulated overdraft over time. And we really look at changes in groundwater levels within the district and how that affects the changes that they might have on the groundwater supplies. And at the end of all that analysis, we estimate the quantity, the source, and the cost of this water that's needed for the replenishment for the ensuing year or the next water year. And our district funds are basically raised through a replenishment assessment, which I'll have a slide later on. Next slide. So these are 4 strategic goals that help guide us in our operations. The first one up at the top is to expand replenishment. And what we mean by that is really mainly securing replenishment sources, recycled water. And then also we want to be able to utilize that available storage space so that we can fill up the basin and then use it for later years. We also want to expand extraction. So we want to maximize pumping in the basin. And so we look and help our pumpers for new extraction sites within the basins. And then we may take on remediation projects. I'll talk a little bit later about one of the regional brackish water projects that we have planned for the West Basin to bring more water to the area. And then we like to do things in an innovative way. We want to increase our efficiency. Those are all really good things to have. And then we also want to promote organizational excellence. We want to be the best at what we do. Next slide. This is just a quick slide on our 5-year strategic plan and how these various planning efforts and programs align with our strategic goals. At the top, there are a couple of mega planning projects that we're working through right now to really make our basin locally sustainable. A couple of those projects, the regional brackish groundwater project that we're talking about, and then also in LA on the northern portion of the Los Angeles forebay, we're working with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power on a joint master planning effort to really maximize the extraction and injection of water in that area. Next slide. So there are a couple of different ways that we manage the basin. First and foremost, we replenish the basin's groundwater. Then we also conduct basin monitoring of over 350 deep nested groundwater monitoring wells that we've installed with collaboration with the USGS. These screens are greater than 1,000 feet, and some of our deepest wells are down to 2,900 feet, so a fairly deep alluvial basin. We've also implemented dozens of groundwater cleanup projects to really help our pumpers address not only just naturally occurring constituents like iron and manganese, but also man-made constituents like volatile organic compounds like PCE and TCE. And then lastly, we have a very robust groundwater basin model that was developed by the USGS. And this really helps us with managing the groundwater basins and going through and evaluating various different scenarios for the future. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we use a lot of water in the basin, and the figure on the right shows the distribution of both inactive and active water supply wells in both of the basins. And if you go to the lower left, and that basically totals things up. So in total, we currently have 423 active water supply wells. And last year, those wells produced a total of about 201,000 acre feet. Now that's a little bit below the total adjudicated right for both of the basins, which is just north of 281,000 acre feet. But we have plans to further utilize both of the basins. And then I also included some of the summaries that come from the Water Master report for each of the basins, just to kind of give you an idea of how each of the basins are different. And that's another role that WRD recently began filling, is to be the Water Master for both of the basins, which is essentially an accounting function of the adjudication. Next slide. So in order to offset the pumping in the basin, we need to replenish the basin, and we do that in two main areas, the spreading grounds and the injection barriers. This is a generalized cross-section through the basin. The aquifers are shown in blue, and the groundwater generally flows from the right-hand side of the figure to the left-hand side of the figure, or from the forebays out to the ocean. The spreading grounds are located on the right-hand side within the Montebello forebay. It's in that area because those sediments in that portion of the basin are predominantly coarse-grained, and they allow surface water to very easily percolate down into the subsurface, thereby replenishing the central basin. The injection barriers are located on the left-hand side of the figure, and they're located along the coast for a reason. They want to prevent seawater intrusion, but they also serve a very important part of our replenishment supply because they provide water to both the west coast as well as the southern portion of the central basin. Next slide. So we use the results of our groundwater model to help us manage the groundwater basins. We look at a 30-year modeling period, which covers from 1971 to 2000, and that's shown on those two black lines there. The groundwater budget looks at the inflows and outflows so that we can calculate the average annual groundwater deficiency. And so in this case, the artificial outflows, or mainly pumping, is about 250,000 acre feet per year. And then the natural inflows, which is a combination of the local water, interior / mountain recharge, and the net underflow, that's about 145,000 acre feet per year. So if you take the difference between those two values, that's the amount of water that we need to balance the basin. So it's roughly about 105,000 acre feet per year. Next slide. So each year we calculate the annual overdraft, and that number is tracked as an accumulation based on our board of directors adopted optimum and minimum quantities for the basin. So on the figure up above, you can see there are two horizontal lines. The upper one is the optimum quantity, which is at 612,000 acre feet. And then there's the minimum quantity, that lower line, which is 900,000 acre feet. And it really is just a balancing act that's ever changing. But we always strive to maintain the optimum quantity, and that's for a good reason, so that we can prepare for this never-ending cycle of droughts that we experience here in the southwestern US. And as you can see from the chart, the past couple decades haven't been very pretty, considering the persistent drought conditions, which may have started around early 2000s. So overall, we're shooting to get back up to the optimum quantity so that when those dry years happen, we'll have plenty of water left in the tank. Next slide. So the way that we fund our operations is through a replenishment assessment, and that helps for us to pay for the water that WRD purchases, but it also helps to fund the projects and programs that we have. So if we take the total cost of service divided by the total groundwater pumped, that's the amount that we end up charging our pumpers. We do it in kind of a unique way where we reach out and seek guidance from our pumping community. And we do that through two different types of committees. The first one being the Budget Advisory Committee, or the BAC, and then the Technical Advisory Committee, or what we call the TAC. And they provide the guidance to our board of directors for them to make decisions on how to raise rates for the replenishment assessment or maintain a certain rate. And all pumpers, regardless of the basin, they're charged the same rate. So it's one fee for across the basin. And currently we're charging $382 per acre feet. And that's for the 2020/21 fiscal year. And if you needed any additional details, we prepare an annual report called our cost of service report. It has a lot of really good historical information, and then it goes into the details of our projects and programs. And at the end of that, there's a pretty lengthy financial analysis of how we come to our replenishment assessment. So next slide. So I'm going to show a few slides after this, really focusing in on the replenishment of groundwater, both the spreading grounds as well as the injection barriers. So next slide. So on the right-hand side, you see this animation of us in the spreading grounds. You know, you fill up the basins, and then that water is allowed to percolate down into the basin, and then it provides replenishment for us to continue our pumping. We don't own these facilities. We just purchase the water, and those facilities are owned by the LA County Department of Public Works. They're responsible for operating them. So there's quite a bit of coordination that goes on between our agencies. And there are essentially two large spreading grounds, the Rio Hondo and the San Gabriel. And then there's also a portion of the unlined San Gabriel River where there's some rubber dams, and then we can do some additional spreading of water in that area. But this is a significant amount of what replenishment that occurs in our basin happens in these areas. Next slide. So each year we budget for various types of waters that will be used for recharge in these spreading grounds. The chart on the left-hand side shows the amount of recharge that we've had each year since 1959. The chart's broken down into the various types of water, so recycled water, imported water, local water, and makeup water. And if there's one main key takeaway from this chart, it would be that you can see that there's an increased use of recycled water, which is shown in purple, and a decreased reliance on imported water, and that's shown on red. And this is really the key concept of one of our major programs that we recently just wrapped up, was the Water Independence Now program. And that was finished with the completion of our advanced wastewater treatment facility. So we really don't purchase imported water for spreading up in the Montebello Forebay area. And instead, we produce about 10,000 acre feet per year of advanced treated water from our Albert Rolla Center in the city of Pico Vera. Now, the lower right-hand side just compares the amount of water we typically anticipate. You know, again, we currently don't budget for imported water. So you'll see on the right-hand side, that value is 0. And so instead, we rely more heavily on the recycled water. And then the figure on the right-hand side is, you know, a basin manager's dream is to have these massively filled basins with lots of water going back into the basin. So next slide. So this is just a real quick animation of the injection along the coast. So we had seawater intrusion. Then LA County installed these series of wells of injection. We inject that water into the basin. We develop a pressure mound to prevent seawater intrusion. And then that water is allowed to replenish the various aquifers. Again, we don't own those facilities. LA County Department of Public Works owns and operates those. And again, so there's quite a bit of coordination that we need to have between our agencies. Next slide. So we have 3 different seawater intrusion barriers, and this is just the data for the last, since 1959. From north to south, those include the West Coast barrier, the Dominguez Gap barrier, and those 2 graphs are shown in the upper portion, the left and right respectively. And then in the lower portion is the Alamitos Gap barrier. And we split that down the middle because it goes across the county line. So half of it is from WRD side and the other half is from Orange County Water District side. And so you can see, similar to the previous slide, for many years we used imported water at the barriers. However, all the barriers are now permitted to accept 100% recycled water. And so we have plans to increase the use of advanced treated water. And one area that we're looking at are injection wells or inland injection wells, because we want to be able to maximize the water that we're generating at our advanced treated facilities. In this case, the Leo J. Vanderlyn's facility that supplies water to the Alamitos Gap area. So a lot of work that we're doing in this area. Next slide. So as we mentioned in one of my earlier slides, as part of the engineering survey and report, we make an educated guess as to the planned water purchases for both barriers and the spreading grounds. And that's based on historical trends as well as the groundwater modeling that was conducted by the USGS. A summary is provided on the right-hand side. And for example, the Montebello forebay, we plan to purchase just over 61,000 acre-feet for that year. And then for the seawater barriers, it's about 28,500. So in total, about 90,000 acre-feet of planned water purchases to replenish the basins and overcome that annual overdraft. And another key point is that these consistent purchases not only help to protect the basin, but they also help to stabilize the replenishment assessment. It really helps to avoid spikes and buying a lot of water and then the RA going up. Next slide. So with all these practices, groundwater basin management practices really have resulted in stable groundwater conditions for the past 50 years. This is a water level graph of 4 key wells in the basins. And you can see prior to WRD's formation, the water levels had dropped to some pretty low levels. And then after we were formed and we started replenishing the basin, those basins recovered and they've stabilized over the past 50 years. Next slide. So I also include a couple of slides to talk very briefly about our plans for the future. Earlier I mentioned our desire to become independent of imported water. And we really accomplished that goal with the water that we purchased for the spreading grounds. We finished the Albert Robles Center, and so now we're no longer purchasing imported water in the spreading grounds. We're now transitioning into what we call our Win for All. So we have the Water Independence Now, or WIN, and now we're expanding that program to the entire basin. Next slide. So really what we're doing is we're trying to aim to use more local water. We want to be able to increase our recycled water use. And then the big part of the puzzle is being able to fully utilize that available groundwater storage space that's now available since the recently amended judgments. All of this would equal, a locally sustainable water supply for our entire region. Next slide. And then lastly, this is just kind of a blow up of that previous figure. These are some of the key projects that we're looking at. You know, a couple of them include these mega recycling projects that are being proposed by folks like LA at their Hyperion plant, as well as MWD and LA County Sanitation District at the Joint Water Pollution Control Plant. We're also looking at some fairly large planning efforts. For example, the large saline plume that's located in the West Coast Basin, that'll be part of our regional brackish water project. But overall, the plans, you know, include increased pumping. We want to be able to get up to that adjudicated amount of 281,000 acre feet, and then more recharge in the basin. So we're looking at putting more water into the barrier, more water into the spreading grounds, and then also the installation of inland injection wells. So for hydrogeologists and lots of engineers out there that want to work in the LA Basin, you know, the future looks bright, but we really couldn't do it without the regional partners that we have. And that includes MWD, LA County Sanitation District, LADWP, LA SAN, and of course, our entire pumping community. So with that, next slide, I thank you. My contact information's there. I think now we're just going to transition over to John for his presentation. So John, why don't you go ahead and take it from here? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, we have very similar operations, as people will see as I get into my presentation. Next slide. So Orange County Water District, we were formed in 1933 by the California legislature. We were actually formed because of a lawsuit that was going on. The agricultural community in Orange County was becoming more and more upset with decreasing flows coming down the Santa Ana River. And the farmers got together and sued people in the upper watershed. I'll give you a slide of the upper watershed. People up in Riverside, San Bernardino, and said, sued those people and said, you need to give us more water in Orange County. And as lawsuits go, lawsuits get expensive, more parties get drugged into it. And the farming community down here said, hey, let's form a water district to take over the lawsuit. And that's actually how we got formed in 1933 to take over that lawsuit. But we manage the Orange County Groundwater Basin, you know, protecting our rights to the Santa Ana River flows. We have a district act also that governs everything we do. I'll talk about that. From that map you see on the right side of the screen, we have 19 cities and special water districts. So, you know, you can think of Brian and I as groundwater wholesalers, and we're selling water to cities and retail water districts who are the retailers. We have 2.5 million customers. Total water demands in our service area are around 400,000 acre feet a year. And for those 19 cities and retail water districts, and I'll start referring to them as producers, but those 19 producers right now get about 77% of the water supply they need from the groundwater basin. And the other 23%, they get imported water coming in from the Colorado River or Northern California. So groundwater, Brian and I, we sell groundwater, and our groundwater is much cheaper than treated imported water. So the producers like to pump as much water as they can, but then we have to sustainably manage the groundwater basin. So we have to make sure water coming out is matched by water we're putting back into the groundwater basin. Just one more quick thing to mention here. You can see we share a boundary with the Water Replenishment District. And our staff and Brian's staff, we've actually tried to estimate how water flows back and forth between our two groundwater basins. Our groundwater basins are connected. It's really just a political boundary that separates us. And we have a model that predicted how much water goes into LA County or comes back from LA County. And Brian has a model. And our two models were measuring different amounts of water going back and forth between our basins. So we've hired a consultant to try to figure out exactly how much water flows between our groundwater basins, just so that we know that and could maybe get us to take some actions in the future. Next slide. So here's a cross section of the groundwater basin. And on the far left, you see the Pacific Ocean. And the Pacific Ocean, just like as in the Water Replenishment District, the Pacific Ocean is hydraulically connected to our groundwater basin. The light blue shows all the various aquifers that hold water, and kind of the light tan colored sediments are aquatards, and which is like more densely compacted clays and silts that don't hold any water. So if you're drilling a well down and you're wanting to pierce the aquifers where you can get groundwater and pump it back out to the surface. And then on the far right, you see Anaheim. Most of our recharge basins where we put water back into the groundwater basin is up in Anaheim. And I'll show you a picture of that. And then we also have, primarily along our coast, there's an amber colored groundwater in portions of our groundwater basin. The water is very good, very clean, but it just has this amber tint. And you pump it out and it looks like iced tea, but it's not something you can sell to customers. So we have some projects to, some of the retailers have projects to remove that colored water before they serve the water. Next slide. I wanted to show how we are in the Santa Ana River watershed. So you see Orange County Water District down on the bottom left. But we're at the bottom of the watershed, and there's some benefits of being at the bottom of the watershed. And the watershed actually starts up around Big Bear Lake. So you can see how big the watershed is. You have San Bernardino, Riverside. This shows 4 other water agencies that we work with. And we work closely with these agencies in the upper watershed because their activities impact how much water we get and impacts the quality of the water we get. And I mentioned earlier how when we were formed, it was because of the farmers in Orange County suing the upper watershed people. We actually had lawsuits in the watershed up to 1969. But in 69, we finally made peace with the upper watershed. We have what's called the Santa Ana River Judgment. And in that judgment, we divided up the river and we guaranteed that everybody would get a little bit of the river. And so we meet with these agencies all the time to keep peace in the watershed, to coordinate with them, to avoid suing them. And we've had a very good relationship with the upper watershed for many decades now. Next slide. So we also have a district act that was passed by the Sacramento legislature that gives us our powers and tells us, exactly what we can do. And basically, it says we will manage the groundwater basin. We can replenish the groundwater basin. We have a lot of different sources of water to replenish the groundwater basin. We protect the quality of the groundwater supplies. We also have to prevent seawater intrusion in our groundwater basin. We establish rates for people who want to pump water out of the groundwater basin. And like Brian mentioned, we also have to prepare an annual report on the condition of the groundwater basin. And we actually have to prove that there's either an annual overdraft of the basin or there's an accumulated overdraft of the basin before we can charge people for water, before we can set a replenishment assessment. Then I also wanted to mention what's interesting. There's a couple powers we do not have. We cannot restrict groundwater production. We cannot tell people you can only pump this amount of water. Now we set the rates people pay for the groundwater production. And so we can indirectly control how much pumping there is in a basin by our rate structure. And I'll explain that later. And then also we can't prevent people from constructing new wells. Anybody in our service area can construct a well anywhere. A city can construct a well in another city. A homeowner, if you're a homeowner and you're mad at your local water department, you can say, I'm going to get off the water department's water and I'm going to build my own well in my own backyard. And you can do that. You're going to need a few $1 million to do it. But and somebody could decide they want to build a well close to the coastline, and we could tell them that's a bad idea, but people can do that. So we do have limited powers here at the Water District. Next slide. So the two big general management objectives we have in managing the groundwater basin are shown here. The first is to manage the groundwater basin to provide a relatively high and stable basin production percentage. And I'll explain the basin production percentage later, but it generally controls how much groundwater is annually pumped. And we have a policy to keep the BPP at least 75%, and right now it's 77%. And as I mentioned before, that means the city can pump 77% of their water needs from the groundwater basin. The other 23%, they're buying imported water from Northern California or the Colorado River. But because groundwater is so cheap, and it's about half the cost of imported water, the producers want, to have a very stable groundwater supply. And so we try to keep the BPP set the same every year. We establish it every year. We try not to change it very much. So we manage based upon average hydrology. And so this year is a very good example of what I'm talking about here. This year we had a really dry year in Orange County and throughout the state, but we kept the BPP at 77%. This year, we're going to overdraft the groundwater basin a little bit because we want people to continue having the same amount of groundwater as they normally do. And so we overdraft the groundwater basin in order to keep the BPP relatively stable. Next year, we could have a dry year and we could overdraft the groundwater basin again, but we would keep the BPP at the same percent, again, to provide a stable amount of groundwater to everybody. But we know over time, the law of averages will kick in, and eventually we'll get a wet winter or maybe a couple wet winters. And those wet winters will refill the groundwater basin. So we let the groundwater basin water levels go up and down in order to maintain a pretty stable basin production percentage. The second thing we do is we manage the groundwater basin as a storage reservoir. And we want to maintain a certain amount of storage supplies for drought periods where imported supplies from the Metropolitan Water District could be restricted. So, and I'll show you also how we do that in a later slide here. Next slide. I want to mention we work to conjunctively operate the groundwater basin with the Metropolitan Water District imported water system. So you can think of it, we have two different major sources of water. We have the groundwater basin, we have the imported water system. And so we have a pretty reliable water supply. And so like during a drought period, maybe we would overdraft the groundwater basin, but then we would work to refill the groundwater basin during times of excess imported water. So we're always working closely with Metropolitan Water District and the Municipal Water District of Orange County to follow what is their supply outlook. Do they have extra water, or is water getting tight for them? But when excess imported water is available, we'll try to buy it to get it into our basin. We also have a contract where we store water for the Metropolitan Water District in our groundwater basin. We have another contract where if Metropolitan has a lot of extra water, but we're not necessarily wanting to buy any that year, they can give us that water and we can pay for it later. That's called a cyclic storage agreement. We also maintain a commercial paper program to provide quick access to funding to purchase large blocks of imported water when they are available. So this water is expensive, and you need to have money available to buy it in large quantities when you want to. In the commercial paper program, it's like a credit card for us, where we can make large purchases. We also had a supplemental storage program with the Metropolitan Water District back in 2006. That winter was a very wet year, and Metropolitan had a lot of excess water, and we took some of it that year. That was a short-term program. Next slide. So this pie chart shows the different sources of water that we use to recharge the groundwater basin. So you can see we have a pretty good diversified portfolio here. We're not overly dependent upon any one source of water to recharge the groundwater basin. I'll just talk about each of these sources. In the upper right is what we call Santa Ana River base flows, 73,000 acre feet a year on average. And when I showed you the graphic of the upper watershed, where you have cities like San Bernardino and Riverside, well, those cities, there's millions of people living in the upper watershed. They generate sewage water or wastewater, whatever you want to call it. That sewage water or wastewater goes to a wastewater treatment plant, and it gets treated to a pretty high degree. And at that point, those agencies can discharge that water into the Santa Ana River. So this is one of the benefits of being at the bottom of the watershed, is a lot of that water just comes to us. Those agencies are getting better at recycling some of that water, but you can see we still get a sizable amount of water coming down to us year round, which originates from a wastewater treatment plant. And we capture that water and put it into the groundwater basin. It gets a lot of natural treatment from Mother Nature in the groundwater basin, and it slowly migrates throughout the basin. In a few years, it can be pumped out and chlorinated, and it's good to go for potable water. The second slice of the pie, Santa Ana River storm flows. So this is when we get the heavy storms in the wintertime, and we'll capture a lot of that water. If you're familiar with Prado Dam, when you drive out toward Corona on the 91 freeway, we work closely with the Corps of Engineers and how they operate Prado Dam, and they will capture storm flows coming down the river for us. Purple slice, natural incidental recharge. When it just naturally rains in Orange County, a lot of that water comes off the foothills surrounding our groundwater basin and gets into the groundwater basin. The red slice is our groundwater replenishment system. This is the largest recycling project of its kind in the world. And we work very closely with the Orange County Sanitation District. People in Orange County should feel good that most of the wastewater they generate, it comes to the Orange County Sanitation District, but then we take it and we purify it to drinking water levels with an advanced treatment project. And then we take the water and we recharge that water back into the groundwater basin. And we're actually in the process of expanding the groundwater replenishment system. And we're going to get to where it's providing about 134,000 acre feet a year of water supplies for us in the next 2 years. That will be done. And then one thing we do also is we buy a lot of untreated imported water from Metropolitan Water District. We try to buy around 65,000 acre feet a year and recharge that into the groundwater basin. This water costs around $800 an acre foot. But by recharging this water, we can allow the 19 producers to pump even more groundwater every year. And when they do that, they avoid buying water from the Metropolitan Water District that is treated that costs $1,100 an acre feet a year. So we're buying untreated imported water, putting it into the groundwater basin, and basically letting the groundwater basin treat it for us. And so there's a large net savings to the region by doing this. And it's just a good water resources strategy to do if you have the facilities to allow you to do it. Next slide. So this graphic shows our groundwater basin accumulated overdraft. A lot of information here. So this is basically showing you how empty or how full the groundwater basin is. If that green line was at the very top, the groundwater basin would be completely full. There would not be any overdraft. And I literally would be getting complaints from the public works directors in Huntington Beach and Fountain Valley that water was seeping up into roads from the groundwater basin. We would have artesian conditions in Huntington Beach and parts of Fountain Valley. So we never want the groundwater basin to be completely full. We always want it to be a little bit empty. And you want to have empty space, because if you get a couple of wet winters, you have to have room to put that water that you capture. You can also see how the kind of the floor for us in operating the groundwater basin is we never want to have an overdraft greater than minus 500,000 acre feet. And that's a soft floor. We can go below that if we need to. But if you overdraft a basin too much, you'll get seawater intrusion in areas that are unprotected. You can also have the possibility of land subsidence if you overdraft a basin too much and don't refill it quicker. You can also have wells that are not deep enough to handle lower water levels. So in general, we try to keep the floor of the groundwater basin at minus 500,000 acre feet. Don't overdraft it below that. And then we have some policies that the board has told us to use in general in managing the basin. And if the basin is relatively full, and I'm pointing up here where the overdraft is between 0 to minus 100,000 acre feet, we have a policy to raise the BPP, raise the basin production percentage, allow more pumping to come out of the basin, and to draw the basin down. From minus 100,000 acre feet to minus 300,000 acre feet, that's where we take no action. That's kind of the sweet operating range for the groundwater basin. And you can see the groundwater basin generally operates within those parameters. When the overdraft gets greater than 300,000 acre feet, that's when we say, okay, we need to maybe put the brakes on, perhaps lower the BPP and or purchase additional imported water. And when the overdraft becomes greater than minus 350,000 acre feet, that's where we say we are going to lower the BPP, we're going to reduce groundwater pumping, and we're going to buy additional imported water. So, but this is a good graphic that shows in general how we manage the basin. I want to show here from 2012 to 2016. 2012 to 2016 is when we had the big drought here in California. You know, there were college professors saying that was the biggest drought that California has experienced since Christopher Columbus, that 5-year period. And you can see, you know, we're managing a reservoir. We overdrafted the reservoir during that period. But then you can see the last few years, we've been working very hard to refill the groundwater basin. We basically have refilled it to minus 200,000 to our recommended operating range. And so if we are heading into another drought period, we are well positioned. Next slide. So I'm going to talk relatively quickly here because I see it's 10 till 12. But when we set, I mentioned we set the rates for groundwater pumping. We cannot tell people you can't pump, but we set the rates. And by setting the rates is how we control production. We have a replenishment assessment, just like WRD does. We have an additional replenishment assessment, a basin production percentage, and I'll explain how these work. What's called a basin equity assessment, a production limitation, and a production requirement. Next slide. So right now, anybody who pumps any groundwater out of our basin, they pay the replenishment assessment, which is $243.50. And that's the RA. And then the additional RA is paid by non-ag production. So the farming community does not have to pay the additional RA, but everyone else does. And the additional RA is also $243.50. So if you're a city, your total bill for buying groundwater is $487 an acre foot that you pay to us. Next slide. So the basin production percentage, as I mentioned, we established it in April. The acronym is BPP, and we use it to control pumping out of the basin. We have a policy to keep it at least 75% or even higher if we can develop programs and projects to do that. We work to avoid changing the BPP by more than 5%. And that's something we do for the producers. The BPP, the formula is simply groundwater divided by groundwater and supplemental water. And supplemental water is imported water. Next slide. So this just gives an example of how our rate structure works. And it is a very unique rate structure, but this is for a typical water utility. So you can say this is a city with total water demands of 30,000 acre feet a year. The city, any groundwater they pump, they pay the RA. And then if they go above the 77% production percentage, they pay the RA and the BEA. And so by setting the BEA, we are generally encouraging people to only pump up to the basin production percentage of 77%. The BEA is set at an amount. So if you go above the basin production percentage and you're buying additional groundwater, the cost of this groundwater is the same as if you were buying imported water. So there's no financial advantage for anybody to pump above the BPP. So most producers limit their pumping to the basin production percentage. Next slide. A graphic showing the historic BPP. You can see it actually came in, we added it to our district act in 1969 to give us this basin management tool. You can see we've had long periods where it's been relatively stable. And then in more recent history, we've been slowly raising the BPP. We're at 77% now. In 2 years, we expect to have it at 79%. And in 3 years, we expect to have it at 82%. So next slide. And how do we set the BPP? Kind of a complicated formula here. This is how the staff establishes a BPP to recommend to our board. But we're basically taking all the water that we expect to get into the groundwater basin, and we use average hydrology. So we got storm flows, natural incidental recharge, Santa Ana River base flows, the met water we buy. Now we subtract out, if we want to try to refill the basin any amount, we subtract that water out. We have the groundwater replenishment system making recycled water. We have some other projects to pump above the BPP, but I won't get into that. And then basically divide that by total water demands. We do subtract out reclaimed water supplies. They're not in the definition of how the BPP is calculated. But and then we come up with a number 77%, and we recommend that to our board. And each year our board decides, do we want to keep the BPP about the same? Do you want to increase the BPP and encourage more pumping? Do you want to decrease the BPP and discourage groundwater pumping? Next slide. Just some management policies we have here that are pretty important. Brian mentioned his groundwater basin has been adjudicated. We work very hard to try to avoid adjudicating our groundwater basin. Adjudicating our groundwater basin today would be extremely expensive and time consuming. And an adjudication is where certain parties feel they're not getting enough water, that they're not being allowed to pump as much as they want. And those parties hire attorneys and they go to court. And you get a judge to adjudicate how much water you're allowed to pump. But what happens, everybody who pumps water from the groundwater basin would have to hire an attorney. And so we have over 200 parties that pump groundwater from the groundwater basin. And they would all go out and lawyer up, and you would go to court, and it would probably take a decade and tens of millions of dollars to adjudicate this groundwater basin. And once it is adjudicated, the judge is telling you basically how you have to operate. you don't have as much flexibility as we have now. We're a managed groundwater basin. We have a lot of flexibility to change pumping, increase pumping, decrease pumping, storing water. And so it would be a great loss for Orange County if our groundwater basin ever did become adjudicated. And so we work to avoid that. The next slide. And part of avoiding an adjudication is we treat everyone the same, or we work to treat everyone the same. And we joke about it, but it's kind of a socialistic system where we have a uniform cost and access to the basin. We try to make sure all producers can pump up to the basin production percentage. All the producers pay the same RA, it's a postage stamp rate. So all of our costs are spread among everybody. We have a lot of costs to prevent seawater intrusion, but that directly benefits the coastal producers, but all the producers pay for that cost. And so we try not to have any distinction between producers. We're all the same. And it's worked very successfully since we were formed. Next slide. And then another policy we have is to invest in local water supply projects. We've developed a lot of recharge facilities in the city of Anaheim, and I'll show you that. It allows us to capture a lot of water coming down the Santa Ana River. We developed the groundwater replenishment system, which allows us to recycle a lot of water. We have a Green Acres project. So the more local water supply projects we can build, the less imported water we need to bring into the area. Next slide. And this is a graphic we're very proud of, and it shows how we've been able to increase the sustainable yield of the groundwater basin over time. And you can see back in the 1950s, typical pumping out of the groundwater basin was about 150,000 acre feet a year. And now you can see it's typically above 300,000 acre feet a year. And that's because of our programs and our projects. We've invested in the groundwater basin, and we have a lot more local sustainable water supply now for the area. Next slide. Then I wanted to show our recharge facilities, primarily in the city of Anaheim. So if you're driving along the 91 freeway and you're near the 55, you see all those lakes to the north. Those are recharge basins. That's where we're putting water in those recharge basins. And then the water slowly percolates down into the larger groundwater basin. So we have over 1,000 acres of facilities up there. But it allows us to capture all the water coming down the Santa Ana River. We also buy imported water, put it in these basins, and we pump water from our groundwater replenishment system that is in Fountain Valley. We pump that water up to some of these recharge basins. So it's a large facility. It's a great benefit to the region, though. Next slide. And I'm going to skip this slide because I know I'm over my time limit. So go to the next slide. And so that's the conclusion of the presentation. And I think Brian and I are available for any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, John and Brian. Really appreciated both your presentations and painting a picture of your respective groundwater basins that you manage in the OCWD and WRD service area. And I know we are at the 12 o'clock mark, but we have a lot of folks on the line still, so to speak, in our virtual room, and our speakers are here to answer some questions. So let's dive right in. One question is a little bit about stormwater. Do you capture stormwater and take this into consideration for the amount of water that's recharged into groundwater basins?
You want to go first, Brian?
Yeah, we capture everything that we can. We've got our spreading basins, and we work very closely with LA County Department of Public Works and the Sand District. And each year we track the amount of water that comes down the rivers. And it's not very often that we lose water to the ocean. Usually it only happens when there's a really too much water to put into the spreading grounds, and just invariably we have to let that water go. But for the most part, they've gotten really good about capturing all that water.
Yes, we do the same thing. We try to capture all the water we can coming down the Santa Ana River, work closely with the Corps of Engineers there might be half a dozen days a year when there's too much water coming down the Santa Ana River. When they start releasing like 5,000 cubic feet per second from Prado Dam, that can overwhelm our facilities, and that can happen, 5 to 10 days a winter. But most of the time, we're capturing all the water coming down the river.
And are there significant groundwater flows from either basin into one another?
I touched on that earlier. It depends on whose model you're looking at. We have a model where we estimated it could be 10 to 20,000 acre feet a year going from our basin to the WRD. WRD has their own model, and they've estimated it's something definitely less than what we have. And so that's why we hired a consultant, Intera, to look at both of our models to try to figure out, come up with a range of, and there could be times where water comes back into the Orange County Basin, but we generally think water is leaving the Orange County Basin, primarily because we operate our basin a little bit higher than WRD. But hopefully this consultant will come back and say, this is a good estimate for flows going back and forth between the basins. And then we'll have that, and it's just information we should have in operating our basins.
Yep. Yeah, and we're looking at two different models, like John had mentioned, and everything. Both of them kind of go into each of the basins, so there is some overlap, and that's really the focus of this evaluation with Intera, is to look at how those models are layered and how they match up, because we have a new sequence stratigraphic model with 13 different layers, and then it has to match up with Orange County side. So that's really the main thing that we're looking at, is groundwater flows between the two, really looking at the water elevations. So you really have to try and match up those two units.
Great. And a question for John in particular, what % of the Santa Ana River base flow and storm flow does OCWD capture for basin recharge?
So base flows we capture at 100%. It's coming down at a rate that we can easily handle with our facilities. But for storm flows, and if you looked at a long-term average, we're probably capturing 60% of storm flows. And you have to understand that, I mentioned previously, when the Corps of Engineers releases 5,000 cubic feet per second out of Prado Dam, that's a lot of water, and it can just overwhelm our facilities. And so we miss a lot of that water on those days when they're releasing that much water. And 5,000 CFS in one day is 10,000 acre feet of water. So that's a lot of water that can get by you. When you look at the long-term averages, and if you have, say, 5 days where you were missing 5,000 CFS, that is a lot of water we don't capture. So that's why our percentage is kind of low when I say we capture maybe 60% of the storm flows coming down the river.
Got it. Thank you. What are, for both agencies, what are your typical demand sectors and profile look like? So highest and lowest consumers or users, and do you do demand side management? An example, varying rates for different sectors. Kind of a few questions in one.
Yeah, well, from Water Replenishment District side, we just purchase the water that goes back into the basin, and then all our pumpers pump the basin, and they're charged the replenishment assessment, and that value is the same for everybody. I don't really have the distribution or breakdown of how much water goes to, say, industry or goes to a potable water system for the water that goes to your house, but they're charged one fee by the Water Replenishment District.
Yeah, and we're identical there. We just charge one rate to the cities that buy our water. We follow total water demands pretty closely from the 19 producers in our groundwater basin. And total water demands have been declining since 2000. Even though we've added more people, they're using less water. So total water demands in our service area used to be 500,000 acre feet a year, and now they're down to 400,000 acre feet a year. So people are just becoming smarter, and the appliances you buy are more efficient. But we're in a similar boat with Brian that we charge one rate to this. And again, it's because we're wholesalers, and then the cities turn around and actually develop water rates for the ratepayers. Yeah.
Great. Does urban runoff get captured as well?
We go ahead, Brian.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually do capture some urban runoff. So this is happening during the summertime. The sanitation district, Orange County Sanitation District, has been very good at working with us. And they will allow, right now they allow up to 10 million gallons a day of urban runoff to be diverted into their wastewater system. And so some programs are getting developed to, right now we're only diverting about 2 million gallons a day of urban runoff into the sanitation district system. And all that water comes to us, and we recycle it for the groundwater replenishment system. So we can create a few more projects to divert even more urban runoff to the sanitation district, which then we recycle.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add is part of the adjudication, it allows us to access the storage. You got to go in front of storage panels, propose projects. And then the benefit of that is that they can claim that water. LADWP did a project in the central portion of the Central Basin, the Broadway project. And so they're capturing water from a neighborhood and then allowing that water to percolate down into the vadosone or the dry soil down below. And then that water eventually replenishes the basin. So they'll get credit for that.
Great, thank you. And a few more questions, if you may. Recent news outlets show that the water supply in Southern California are doing better than agencies up north. If the drought continues for the next few years, what is the timeline to hit the minimum groundwater level?
Go ahead, Brian. You've been going first.
Well, for us, it's based on our minimum and optimum quantities, and that is going to be just ever changing. So just like Orange County, they have their goals, right? You've got this little soft bottom that you don't want to go down below because there are undesirable results for that. You might have subsidence and things along those lines. And so we tend to build up our basin, our storage, and for the dry periods, and then draw down the basin. And then we just know that the law of averages tells us that we're going to have, a wet winter or two. And you'll see in our graphs, I think it's similar for both of us, that the spike goes up rather quickly because we get a lot of water and we're able to store a lot of water through our spreading grounds. So that's very helpful.
Yeah, I did a quick calculation. And so this past year was relatively dry, really dry. But we would need to have 5 more years like we just had, really, really dry winters before we would kind of get down to what we consider our bottom of the basin. So the odds of that happening are pretty small. And the odds of getting a wet year in there are pretty high. So, but if we had 5 more really dry years like we just did, we might get down to what we consider the bottom of our basin.
Yeah, and people are talking about, the concept of a mega drought, right? This last 20 years. And so, hopefully we've hit the bottom of that cycle and we can start to bank on some more wet years to come. This year was a really dry year. And, if it wasn't for a release that happened from last year's rain events, our basin would be a lot less full. So we were happy for that. And then hopefully we'll make it through this period and then we'll just fill the basins back up again and just go through that ever up and down cycle of just managing the basin.
Great. So we're talking a little bit about weather, but this has to do with infrastructure. Are you looking at any future potential infrastructure modifications based on climate model projects?
I'll let you go first, John.
Well, we are, we're recycling as much water as we can. So that helps offset any impacts from climate change. And I mentioned, we'll be recycling 130,000 acre feet a year of water here in the next couple of years. So that goes a long way of providing you a base supply of water where you don't have to worry too much about future climate change. We are watching the climate change issue. If ocean water levels were to climb to, I see some of these models, they're saying ocean water levels can go up 5 feet or 8 feet, but that would happen over decades of time. But if that were to happen, that would put pressure on our seawater barriers, and we would have to beef up our seawater barriers and put in more injection wells, maybe inject more water. That could be a direct impact from climate change. But in general, we've heard people say that the storms we get in the wintertime could become flashier and maybe larger, but maybe more infrequent. So that would be a challenge, trying to capture, storms with that type of characteristic. But right now, we don't see too much of an impact from possible climate change to us in how we operate.
All right. I guess the only thing I would add in for us, we're fortunate that there are 2 big mega recycling projects that are on the horizon. There's the Hyperion plant as well as the joint plant. And that could provide a ton of water to our basins, as well as sending water to Orange County and to others to the north of us. And I think that'll help to make our basins a little bit more resilient and not really have to worry so much about how things pan out with the climate.
Great, thank you. And we'll get just the last question here for today. Given the health and the potential for expansion of both LA and OC basins, how would you assess the need for a desalinated water supply?
Well, for us, we're interested in looking at ocean desal, and most people know we entered into a term sheet with Poseidon Resources to look at developing the ocean desal plant in Huntington Beach. And we're interested because if you look at long-term projections of where our water will need to come from, you go out 25 years, 30 years, we're still going to need to import a lot of water from Northern California or the Colorado River. Around 100,000 acre feet a year we'll still need to import. And so there's all sorts of potential issues with imported water and how much will be available, 25 years out into the future. So Poseidon would be a new water source in our backyard in Huntington Beach. And so it would greatly reduce how much imported water we need to bring into the area. So that's why our board is looking at the project very closely. We're waiting to see if the project can get all of its permits. And if it can, then our board will decide on negotiating a final water purchase contract with Poseidon and potentially going ahead with the project. It is more expensive water, but it goes a long way in increasing your supply security. And so that's what's happening in Orange County.
Yeah, and we've got plans to deal with the brackish plume that was left behind when the seawater injection barriers were installed. It left behind a rather large saline plume. It's about 300,000 acre feet of water available. And so we're looking at remediating that, kind of a desalter project. So that would be 300,000 acre feet of new water for that area. And then we would have to replenish that, obviously, from either Hyperion or joint plant water. But that's a lot cheaper than having to treat, the salty ocean water. So the economics really do work out really well for us. So that's on the planning horizon for us.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. That is the last of the questions that we received during in our Q&A box here. So I just wanted to extend a huge thank you again to John and Brian for speaking today and joining us for our webinar. And thank you to all the attendees who joined us today, and for all of you who stuck around a few minutes after the hour here to hear the Q&A portion. And again, I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded and will be posted to the OCWD website and YouTube page as well. So it's available after as well. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
All right, great.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.